And now, please join me in welcoming Joshua Ofman, Chief of Corporate Strategy and External Affairs at GRAIL, and Janice Chen, Co-founder and Chief Research Officer at Mammoth Biosciences, and here to lead the conversation is my colleague, Atlantic staff writer Alexis Madrigal. Alexis, take it away.
Thank you. So good to, I live in Oakland. I'm a Bay native. I have two things to say before we get going. One is, I love the kind of almost dinner cabaret vibe we have with these tables down here. Like, I'm not gonna dance, not gonna sing, but it's another career, you know? The other thing I wanted to say is that I do primarily write about the other kind of technology, and there are two things that I really love about doing biotech events. One is that the rooms tend to approach gender parity, as this one does, which is fantastic, unlike writing about software or attending software events. And you all have actual expertise, which is a real surprise when you write about the other kind of technology. And it's just always a pleasure to meet people who've spent like 10 years learning things that most people know nothing about and would have a hard time explaining to their parents. Let's get to you guys. We have a pretty heavy-hitting set of entrepreneurs here. Why don't you give us just kind of the origin stories of your company so people kind of know where you're coming from?
Sure, I'll kick things off. My name is Janice. I'm one of the co-founders of Mammoth Biosciences, and just to give you a little quick history of where things began, I did my graduate work in Jennifer Doudna's lab at Berkeley, and during my time there, myself and one of my current co-founders, Lucas Harrington, and some other colleagues in the lab, we've been spending a lot of time discovering and characterizing and developing new CRISPR technologies, not just for gene editing, but in many other applications. And during that work, we came across this unexpected finding that you could not just use CRISPR for gene editing, but you could also use it for detection. And that was a real surprise when we first came across that possibility, and we collaborated with a physician at UCSF to test whether or not we could actually use this technology and validate it with the existing gold standard test. And I think at that moment was when we really had that aha moment and felt like this was actually real, and there's a real potential in using CRISPR in this completely different way. And we were wrapping up our graduate work and also had nothing to lose at that point. And so we decided, okay, let's start a company. We have no idea what we're doing. What we didn't know at the time was that there was another group at Stanford, recent graduates who were also just starting to hear the buzz about CRISPR Diagnostics, and they were starting a company out of the kind of similar core technology. And kind of in our pathways that started out in parallel, we realized that it made a lot of sense to basically join forces. So it's one of those rare Berkeley-Stanford collaborations that, bears are obviously better, but we've made it work so far, and it's been quite an exciting journey.
Well, as a Berkeley graduate, that is blasphemous, first of all. My name is Josh Ofman. I'm the Chief of Corporate Strategy and External Affairs at GRAIL. I'm about 5 months in my tenure at GRAIL, but let me tell you about how GRAIL started. So in 2014, Illumina is the largest gene sequencing company, DNA sequencing company, and the chief medical officer there and some other scientists did an experiment, and they thought maybe rather than pregnant women undergoing amniocentesis, which carries a risk of an aborted fetus, that maybe they could do that by looking at the maternal blood and sequencing DNA that is transmitted into the maternal bloodstream through the placenta, very small bits of DNA, and avoid the risk of amniocentesis. So they did a study in about 125 healthy pregnant women, and when they sequenced the DNA, they determined two things. First, yes, they could replace amniocentesis, and now that's done. There's now a new non-invasive prenatal test that does that. But they detected about 10 of these women who had a cancer signal when they saw the DNA, and it looked like they had cancer. They called those women back, and sure enough, almost all of them had an occult malignancy, and these were young, healthy, pregnant women. And so the light bulbs went off at Illumina that maybe we have a way of doing a blood test to detect cancer and detect cancer early. And they spun off this company called GRAIL, and the first CEO was someone named Jeff Huber, who was a Google executive who his wife had been struck with late-stage colon cancer, and had that been diagnosed earlier, she might have had a different outcome. And he became the first CEO, and that began the story of GRAIL, which is focused on using the blood to look at small pieces of DNA in the blood and detecting cancer signals by looking not at gene mutations, but at methylation patterns, the epigenetics of DNA, and detecting cancer signals. And it's really a convergence of machine learning and artificial intelligence with genomics, and it's a great example.
I just have to ask, because it was such a sensation, did bad blood and the sort of downfall of Theranos have any impact on you guys? Or were people like, no, different technologies, using the blood, but very different?
Yeah, it's been fascinating for me as, particularly when you're in Washington, D.C., and you say you're a Silicon Valley startup with a blood test, immediately everybody says, oh, Theranos. So there is absolutely a Theranos effect. And that's had an impact on GRAIL. We're very focused on producing a lot of data, being totally transparent, publishing it extensively, presenting it continuously at medical meetings, doing the largest studies known in genomic medicine to date, and also working with some of the largest institutions, in the world to do this.
It kind of leads to a slightly more general question. Obviously San Francisco and Silicon Valley and the Bay Area in general are heavily influenced by the technology ecosystem that developed down around Stanford and kind of has been coming up the peninsula and into the rest of the Bay. Do you, as we watch kind of big tech get slapped around by various different people, how do you think that affects the biotech side from your perspective as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's been I think, really eye-opening experience. We're seeing big tech investors starting to put feelers out in biotech, which is in a really exciting time, because what that means is our technology is starting to scale very rapidly. We're able to, really thinking about engineering biology and not just, doing bespoke experiments. And I think that influence on both sides is really a great collaboration that's kind of really grown in the last few years. And so it really helps us think about life sciences and biology in a different way, and I think, it's really interesting to watch the two kind of paths merge.
Yeah, I think similarly, it's in an unexpected way, it's been helpful for biotechnology and healthcare as more technology gets focused in the healthcare arena, and as we apply it. So GRAIL's a great example. When I showed up there, there was a admixture of genetic engineers and software engineers, and that collaboration, that different approach to how they work and how they do experiments and how they redesign their work has been fascinating. And I think it's that type of collaboration that can really spur innovation in our field.
So as you're seeing sort of a different class of investors, different type of investors come into biotech, though, one thing I saw earlier in my career was watching green tech companies try and get funding from traditional technology investors, and those investors expecting kind of unrealistic things from these more capital-intensive, long-term endeavors. In fact, I started to call it Moore's curse instead of Moore's law, because it seemed like a lot of the technology VCs expected everything to take the same kind of form as the improvement of the shrinking of transistors. So what are the things that technology investors bring to you? I know you mentioned one of the good things, this focus on scale. But what are the other things that they bring to the table, their kind of assumptions about how your business should work that do or do not help you?
Well, I think there's always been a really big focus on building products, which sometimes you don't really think about coming from life sciences. You work with organisms, you maybe are interested in certain pathways, but ultimately you're trying to create value out of the experiments that you're doing. And so I think that product-focused perspective actually really helps you think about building a business, which is something I've really appreciated from kind of the tech investor perspective.
Yeah, I think there are two issues that seem to be unique in biotechnology and healthcare that is very different in technology, traditional tech. One is intellectual property, how that's managed, how it's used. The time scale of product development is quite different, the versioning, the rapid change, and the fact that it's a heavily regulated environment. Those are very different. So you see now big tech moving into medical devices and software that is now regulated by the FDA. That's a big shift for them. And so my experience has been that those three factors need to be thought about a little bit differently in biotech.
Hey, how's that work? Who's sort of developed to guide the tech investors along that path?
So,
Are there people who've come about within the ecosystem who are sort of like, hey, tech investor, come along with me. I'm going to show you how this works in our realm?
I'm not aware of any sage leaders of that nature, but I can tell you that as they engage with the companies, they are providing a lot of input and insight into how their business works and what is applicable to ours. And I think that's very insightful. Sometimes it's really applicable, and other times we say, well, you know, that wouldn't work in a highly regulated environment.
So in the old days of biotech, a lot of people would say, well, you know, the pace of technology, we just look over here at these software and hardware companies that are doing great. You know, they're in a much less regulated space. As regulators come for that side of the tech industry, and you see lots of support for it, even among maybe even people here in this room, do people in biotech still make that argument, or has that changed? Have they stopped saying, yeah, you know, look over how great this unregulated tech environment is over there. We should look more like them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important conversation to have, especially, you know, if you're working in healthcare. I mean, I think oftentimes people say, oh, the FDA, you know, creating all these bottlenecks and obstacles, but I think really it's a benefit to society and to the products that we're trying to build is to work with regulatory agencies, work with the FDA to actually bring the best products out there. I think without that kind of conversation and collaboration, I do think it's probably ultimately more harmful than good.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think where we're at in healthcare right now is we have got to make a transition in our healthcare system from a system that's focused on fixing what's broken to a system that's focused on prediction, prevention, and early detection. And if we don't make that transition, healthcare will indeed become unsustainable in this country. And part of making that transition is having a regulatory and policy environment that facilitates rapid innovation, but safely and in the public health's interest.
You know, it does seem, as an kind of outsider to the field, it does seem that diagnostics have really come up a lot in kind of the mix of things that are being funded and are working in the biotech and healthcare space. What are the factors that are driving that right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Theranos earlier on. As much as they've created quite a storm, but they really, I think, defined a market. And then actually, when they were removed, people recognized that, oh wow, we could really benefit from something that's point of care, point of need, really accessible to patients. So from that perspective, it's actually really interesting seeing how Theranos really created this whole space, and now there's a lot of interest in actually being able to execute on that. I think the other interesting side of diagnostics is, when you're talking about a product development life cycle, it's much shorter than, say, getting a therapeutic that's fully gone through regulatory and clinical trials. And so having the faster life cycle, I think, definitely plays a role in creating value quickly.
I think the other part of the answer is the unmet medical needs can be really well served by informative diagnostics. So just cancer is a great example. Cancer is the #2 killer in the world. It's going to become the #1 killer. We're losing, almost 2,000 loved ones a day to cancer. And it's largely, why is that happening? Because we are diagnosing cancer too late. At late stages, we only screen for 4 cancers. So a genomic technology like the one we're working on at GRAIL that's now been validated has the ability to, with a single blood test, identify over 20 cancers with less than a 1% false positive rate. And that, is dramatically better than any of the other screening tests that are available today. So the opportunity to dramatically change the arc of cancer mortality is what sits before us. And I think it's those large opportunities to make a big impact in public health that are driving a lot of these innovative genomic-based diagnostic approaches.
So as you try and make that impact and scale up these companies, what are the things that hold you back here in San Francisco? I mean, you've mentioned all the things already, the venture capital ecosystem that exists that's good, the amazing educational institutions, it's the greatest place to live on earth, and all those things, which I believe as a resident of this place. But what are the things that are holding you back at this point? Or that make it more complicated or difficult or expensive?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we feel like we have to compete against, all the other very successful companies in the Bay Area. So as far as there's tons of talent around, but what that also means is that all the talent are, happily employed. And so from that perspective, it can be challenging to recruit because it's such a, healthy ecosystem right now. But that is something that we have the benefit of having here. I think the other side of the Bay Area is, I think there's really a culture of entrepreneurship, which is something that I've really benefited from, and being able to connect with other founders and other, serial entrepreneurs about how they've gone through their journey, and having that support system, I think really makes a difference when you're trying to go out and try something new.
Yeah, it's a brutal war for talent here, for sure. I think it cuts both ways. On the one hand, you've got this incredible pool of talent due to the universities, the innovation ecosystem here. On the other hand, it's a war for that talent, and recruiting from outside the Bay Area is just insanely difficult because of the cost of living here. And I think there's also a culture clash that can occur between what is more traditional biotechnology and what is more big tech. And I think that culture clash is settling, and I think normalizing and getting easier to work with. But I think that's been a barrier in the past that hopefully won't be going forward. But it is not easy to retain your talent and to recruit it into this area.
Let's take some questions from people out there. Anybody want to get in? There's people with a mic, so great.
Hi, so both GRAIL and Mammoth are technology pushes. I wonder if you two could discuss how you choose which market and application is best suited for your technology.
I can take that. Obviously, there's a number of factors that go into that. You have to fully understand, your own technology. A great example is GRAIL. I think when GRAIL first began its study as a company, it thought that perhaps we would be tackling individual cancers. Go after screening for breast cancer, colon cancer, and then when the data emerged, it became very clear that GRAIL had a pan-cancer or a multi-cancer test in its hands, and they had to pivot. And this was in 2017, where they pivoted and actually changed the nature of some of their large clinical studies. And so, it's a combination of where's the unmet medical need. There are a lot of people doing genomic work in advanced cancer patients, but that's not where the big unmet need is. The big opportunity in cancer is to drive early detection, where cancers can be treated much more effectively, patients have much better outcomes, and costs are much lower. And that's the opportunity. And so you combine your own technological advance with what it can do clinically and analytically with the unmet medical need, and that's the best formula.
Yeah, and I would agree with that 100%, is to start with the problem and then figure out what are your competitive advantages with your technology and how can they provide a solution. Obviously, we also think about product market fit, who is actually going to use this, what benefits are they going to get out of it, and also validation through external partners. So as a small startup, we have to often rely on the ecosystem out there and think about how can we provide tools that can really be enabled by other companies that perhaps have different expertise and can really drive it in different ways. And so having that kind of external partnership and validation is also really helpful in helping us think about where do we focus our energy.
And are you already at that point? Like you're already trying to get a product out into the market right now?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time in the research and early development phase and really starting to move into product development now at this stage. So, we have, our roadmaps for how we're going to get the products to market, but certainly, it's a iterative cycle.
Tamara, and my question is more for Joshua. You're talking about prevention and early detection. But something that I see is happening, more and more young people get cancer. And cancer, as you said, is going to be the #1 killer. So something is happening that makes people sick so early and in such huge numbers. And everybody is looking at catching the disease when it's already there. Is anybody looking at why it is happening and what needs to happen? And I'm afraid I'm asking the wrong person because most likely it's a social issue, not a healthcare issue, but I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, you're bringing up a really important point that, the two elements that are going to, bend the curve in cancer mortality are going to be prevention and early detection. And there is quite a lot of work going on in prevention. And, these are dietary factors, exposure factors. Obesity is driving a changing incidence of cancer and cancer types. Cancers are becoming, we're finding them earlier in younger people now because of the incidence is changing. But certain cancers, the incidence is getting better. Other cancers, it's getting worse and moving into younger populations. But there's no doubt that a focus in prevention is going to be critical for us to make an impact in cancer.
Great. Thank you two very much.
Thank you.